Today we're going to talk about object-oriented JavaScript. So we're going to learn how we can abstract our code a little bit more and separate our concerns a little bit more. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions they need addressed about any of the JavaScript stuff that we've covered so far?
I've got a question. I'm not sure if it's necessarily in the material, but
Okay.
Is there a way, even if you're in debugger, right, or in the console and everything, where, let's see, what was I doing yesterday that was a good example? I'm pretty sure I'm not phrasing this correctly, but you know how you could see params in Ruby and everything like that, and to a certain degree you can see it certain times in JavaScript. But when it's passing values, is there a way in the console to just see what everything is being passed around in JavaScript?
I don't really know what you mean.
So give me 1 second. Let me go back to what I was doing yesterday real quick. Okay, so like when you're doing a reduce method and it's almost like promises and stuff like that. Like without trying to console log out what that promise is there a way to just be in console and say, hey, show me everything that you're passing around? Like show me the promise without saying promise. Does that make sense at all?
Still no.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, it's just like pry, where like when you're in pry, you don't see anything, you don't know anything until you actually start looking at like what values things have. So you have to start typing in like variable names, and then it'll tell you like what value they have.
I guess, is there a call to show any and all values?
Not that I know of. So, but I mean, you can still save whatever you want to a value. So like, for example, fetch is just a function that returns a promise.
Yeah.
So if you say like const whatever equals fetch, and then you do your whole fetch, then you can look at whatever, and then you can see the actual promise, and then you can see like the promise value, which would show you what's in there. The problem with debugger is it pauses, and so if you pause before the fetch is complete, then it doesn't finish the fetch, so it's like stuck pending.
I guess like okay, it's similar to the promise, but like in a reduce function, there's the accumulator and the current value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the example in the lab, because you're passing, you're calling a function in the current value argument, and then that function is using the accumulator in the current value, right? But unless in your function you had specified that, argument name of the accumulator and argument name of current value, there would be no way to call. Like, I guess there's the only thing you know is, hey, whatever I called it within the arguments. But naturally, it's already like the JavaScript is already passing that information around, but you can't see it, right? So I'm wondering if there's any way you can say, hey, you know what? Just show me what information is being passed around at this point.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because if arguments get passed in to a function, but the function wasn't defined in such a way that it's ready to receive those arguments, like nothing breaks, but those arguments are basically by definition not accessible.
Right.
So you'd have to have some named arguments in the function definition.
Yeah.
And then, but then at that point, it's easy to just look at those particular variables. But I don't know of a way to just like figure out like here's all the variables or functions that exist. I guess, I don't know, maybe if you look at the window object, if you're in like a console,
Yeah.
it might have a bunch of stuff on it, but I don't know.
Okay, I figured it was a tough one. I didn't have much hopes on that one, but okay, cool. I figured I'd ask anyway, just in case.
Okay, no worries.
All right, thanks.
So let's see, I'm going to share my screen and I'll open up this Blogger thing. I'm not sure how much of it we're going to use. If we have time, we'll get to it, but because I want to at some point abstract a lot of our front end code so that we're using object oriented, but have all this extra stuff that I don't really want. I guess it's all, get rid of that. I think I also changed my controller. Yeah. I'll have to fix this stuff later because this is like a mix of fast JSON and regular serializers. Let's see. So let's just work in here. So I've got a console open in Chrome. And here's how objects, like in the very beginning of JavaScript, there wasn't a lot of option other than if you wanted to create some objects, then you could say like, here's an object, and you'll define it like literally. So you'll just have the object like this, and I'll say name. If that's a property I want, I'll put my name, and then age 59. Now, if I wanted another object that is following that same pattern, then I'll have to just do this, and I'll say like another, and then here I can say like Jake is 22. As you can see, this gets really tedious, even when I have the little up shortcuts that will retype stuff that I did. So like the most intuitive shortcut for this, and in fact, while this is quote unquote the old way, this is still in very wide use. And in my opinion, I kind of like it best, but a way to have like reusable code that can create objects like this is by creating something called a factory. And it doesn't have to be called a factory, but that's like what the pattern is called. So oftentimes the function is also called a factory. So we could say like a person factory. And I'm going to take name and age. And this function is going to return an object. And that object is going to have a name key. And then this is where I pull down this argument. So I'll say name is name, age is age. And I don't think JavaScript has always been like this, but in more recent versions, at the very least, there's a shorthand for writing all this because these are actually named the same as each other, like age and age, name and name. I can shorten it to do name, age, and it will automatically look like that. Okay, so if I hit enter, now we've got this person factory. If I execute that, then I can give it Morgan 59. Now I get this object. So I don't have to define it literally anymore. I've got this little factory method that I pass the arguments, and it spits out my sort of end result object that I wanted. So now I can just, anytime I want another person, instead of defining an object literal, I just execute this function and give it these arguments, and it will define the object according to the arguments that I give it. Does anybody have questions on the factory pattern that I just demonstrated?
How come you're not setting it to, like in the, what is it? This is like a deconstructor, right? Is that, well, maybe I'm not using the vocabulary right. In the,
for one thing, if I wanted this object for any reason, I would have had to set it. So I would have said like Morgan equals person factory Morgan 9, and then I'd have this object saved.
okay, I think that's where I was getting it. I was like, okay, so where, you know, there was the name, there were basically these keys and values, but not assigned to anything. And I was like,
yeah. So
okay.
this wouldn't be useful to do on its own. I would need to set a variable to whatever this returns, basically. Okay. So then I actually have a way to reference this object.
Got it. I'm clear.
Perfect. So let's say I want to, I want these person objects to be able to introduce themselves. So I might, I'd want to say like Morgan.introduce. That's kind of my goal. So we need to change our person factory. So I'll go back up to where we defined that. I'm going to redefine this function. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to say it has a name, it has an age, and it has an introduce, which is going to be a function. And here, I'm going to turn hi. My name is, or I'll just say, hi, I'm name. And I'm age. So this return value is inside this function, which is the value for this key in this object that I'm returning. So the formatting is a little weird, but that's what's going on. So now when I say let Morgan equal this thing, oh yeah, I've already declared this, so I'm just going to reassign it. So Morgan is now whatever this thing returns, which includes this extra key. If I say Morgan dot introduce, now I've got this method. Problem is this method is set in stone. So if I say Morgan dot age equals 28, then my introduce still says 59. This is a consequence of this method being defined in a closure. That means that I'm using name and age, which were passed in as arguments here. So this function will forever use what these arguments were rather than what the values here become if I mess with my object. So I think there's a way around that, which is like if I go back to this, I may be able to say this dot name. Let's see what that does. This dot age. Okay, so I've got my person again. This still works, yeah, okay. So now if I change the age, and now this gives me the new age. So this made it so that instead of acting as a closure, I'm not actually using my these arguments anymore in this function. I'm referring to this dot name and this dot age, which refers to the object that I'm defining in this factory. So as name and age change, then it will change what this function returns. Any questions about that? Okay. So there is still a bit of a problem here, which is, let's say I do, I'll go back to the other example where I'll say Jake. Yeah, okay, so let Jake equals person factory Jake do. If I compare, so I've got this Jake object and I've got this Morgan object. These functions, this introduce function, looks the same as this one. I'll say like Jake dot introduce. I'm not going to call it. I'm just going to look at it. Pretty generic. Whoops. And then Morgan dot introduce. Literally the same thing.
Morgan,
go ahead.
Sorry, real quick. How is it that you're able to call the introduce function when it's inside of another function? I thought, like, I had the impression that you wouldn't be able to reach in, like there would be a scope issue if that was the case.
It's because I'm defining it as a value to a key in an object. So
Oh, I
I'm
see.
not just defining it inside the function. I am, but I'm particularly making it part of the return value. So I'm returning this entire object whenever
Right.
I call this.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So they look exactly the same, but they are not the same. So I can prove that. I can say Jake.introduce equals Morgan.introduce, and I get false. So logically, this means if I were to create 1,000 people, then I would actually be creating 1,000 different functions that were all perfect carbon copies of each other, apart from the fact that they occupy different space in memory. So I'd be using up a lot of extra RAM um, for creating all of my people that I didn't need to use. So there are a couple solutions to this. One is I define this introduce out here. So introduce, it's going to go like this, and I'll say return. I'll just copy and paste this actually. If I can. Okay, so now I've got this introduce. I can call it out here. It's just going to say undefined for those values because in this context, they don't mean anything. It's kind of weird. This one didn't say undefined. I think this name is just a blank string for some reason by default in like an empty console. But anyway, let's change up our person factory. So I'm going to go back to our factory definition. And I want to not define the function here. I'll say name, age, introduce, and then I'm just going to use that introduce function that I just defined up here. And so I could have gone with the shorthand. I could have said like this, and it would do the same thing. So now when I look at person factory, it's this function that takes in name and age, and it returns name, age, introduce. Introduce is a sort of discrete function that I've defined one time up here. So now when I create a new person, so person factory, I still call .introduce and it still works. I can still change my age or name. And introduce still adapts, basically returns the correct thing. Now I can say Jake equals person factory. Jake, age 22. What did I do wrong here?
I might be wrong, but I think you were not supposed to put age there.
Yeah, you're right. Because I didn't define it with keys or anything. Thank you. I was just staring at that like, what the heck? Okay, so now I've got this Jake.introduce. That works. But the important thing here is I can say Morgan.introduce equals Jake.introduce. And we can see that that is actually true now. So they're actually referring to the same method, meaning I can create 1,000 people and they all use the same introduce method. But they, that I've defined out here, they don't have to redefine it upon every definition of a new person. So it saves on memory. So this is all very well and good, and I actually like this approach best probably for various reasons. But JavaScript wanted more people to adopt it. And there's especially several years ago, object-oriented was like super, super popular. And in order to draw more developers into JavaScript, they decided to go from sort of a procedural approach to things and functional approach to things to try to adopt some like object-oriented patterns and syntax. Because all this stuff is pretty unfamiliar if you are used to using something like Ruby or Java or any number of programming languages that are designed to be object-oriented. Because we're used to setting up a class and doing like a class and then doing like person.new or maybe new person or something like that. So we kind of got there into like an object-oriented JavaScript pattern incrementally. So I'm going to show you the ES15, or no, sorry, the ES5 version of how to do this. So an ES5 version of this would be, we'd create a new function. We'd call it a person with a capital P. This person function is going to, I believe, still take just name, age. And it's going to say this dot name equals name. This dot age equals age. And I think that is all I need here. I guess if I'm going to do that, that's a introduce thing. I could do a similar thing where I've got the introduce method defined out here. And I can say this dot introduce equals introduce. But there's another approach I can do when I do this. So let's do this first. I'll say, let's see, Morgan is going to now equal new person. I'm going to give it those arguments. Now that returns this object that's labeled as a person object, and it's got these properties. So whenever I define a function with ES5 syntax using like this capital P person, this sort of acts as my factory now. That it takes the age, and this refers to the object that this factory will return. So this object now gets a name key with a name value and an age key with an age value. So I can do the same. Jake equals Jake. Sorry, Jake equals new person. Yeah. So now I've got these people. Something interesting, if I look in here, you may have noticed this before, but objects will always have this thing in here called a proto. If I look at Morgan.proto, then I get this thing, and it'll tell me the constructor. It will also tell me basically any methods that can be called on this object. Somebody said something in the chat. I didn't see what it was. And now I can't get to it. Let me see.
Laura was just asking if you need the new. Since it's a function, can you run capital P person without the new?
Person. So I think this makes it so that, let's try this. Laura is going to be 5 years old. So it doesn't like return anything. So I think it executes technically, but because I didn't say to create a new person, it doesn't bother returning anything.
To call just capital P person right now, would it show Morgan, Laura, and Jake?
No. So I'm not saving those anywhere except to the variables that I created. So person is just a method. So, or it's just a function. So I get this function back.
Is there a way to call upon, I guess, all the person, because you're creating all these people, is there a way to say, hey, give me all these objects back without first assigning them to a variable? I guess it's almost, in my mind, I'm trying to equate it to like a person.all.
Right. So there's a way to set that sort of thing up, but there's nothing by default.
Okay.
And it's not super easy to set up with ES5 syntax. It gets easier with ES6. So we'll talk about it in a minute.
Okay.
But right now I can't call any methods on these people. If I look at the prototype, the only method that exists is the constructor, which we've already seen. The constructor is like just the function that gets called when I'm creating a new one. So it's just this stuff. Even the person, because when I say proto, that's referring to, I can also say like person dot prototype. And that gives me an object, and that's telling me it's got keys and values, which are just the methods that can be called on a person in general. So Jake dot __ proto equals person dot prototype. That's true. So these are the same thing. So the class.prototype is the same as the instance dot underscore proto underscore underscore. The reason this is important is that because that's true, I can add something to this prototype. So person.prototype, if we remind ourselves, it's just an object with keys and values. Right now, it's just got this one key and this one value. So I can add that. So I can say, here's another key, is introduce. I'm going to set this equal to a function that will say, I'm this dot name. Oops. And I'm stage. So now when I look at person.prototype, I've got this extra key and this extra function value. That means even these people that I created earlier, Jake and Morgan, they still only have these two keys and values. But if I say Morgan dot underscore underscore prototype, or underscore, sorry, proto, then I can see I've got this introduce method in the prototype of the class that Morgan belongs to. So since Morgan is a person, and that's part of the person.prototype, I can now say Morgan.introduce, and this works. Jake.introduce. And these are both the same thing, because they're both getting it from the same place. They both belong to person.prototype. So any method that I add to this object will now be available to be called by any of the instances. So it's kind of cool. I can do it on the fly. Anytime I want, I can add something to this prototype. It now applies as a callable method on any instance that I've already created or in any instance that I will create in the future. Any questions about that? Okay. Something interesting is our person, as we can see, is just a function. Let's see if it has its own proto instead of prototype. And it does. So that's this function, which I'm not really sure what this is, but it exists out there somewhere. Let's say object.prototype. Not the same, I don't think. Yeah, I don't know what that is. I feel like eventually you can get up to object.prototype, but I guess I can look at, let's see, that's something. What if I call that method? No, that won't work because this called doesn't do anything unless I say new. Then I just end up with a new person object. So let's see. So that's how we figure out basically class-like syntax to do pretty much the same exact thing that we figured out with this factory. One nice difference is this method doesn't have to be defined just in sort of the global namespace for my factory objects to share it, because I've got this prototype that I can store it directly in. So I say, where did I do that? Right here. I created this introduce key, and then this function was the value for that key. And then all of the instances share this function as their introduce method. So this wasn't good enough to satisfy the people who really loved object-oriented JavaScript. It's still missing something a little bit on like syntax, and people didn't really like this was still unfamiliar, like setting objects on a prototype or setting keys on a prototype that are then available for all the instance objects. People didn't like that way of thinking or syntax very much. So I think in like 2015 or so, ES6 came out. So about 4 years ago. And ES6 brought with its class syntax. So I can just say class person, but then inside my person class, I will actually literally create a constructor. This is similar to initialize in Ruby, where this will automatically get called anytime I instantiate a new instance of a person. So constructor, I'm going to say name, age, and I'll say this name equals name, this age equals age. And if I want my people to all have an introduce method, then I just declare it in here. And I'll say return. See if I can copy it and paste from somewhere else. There we go. Okay, I have to call it something else. I'm going to call it person2. It's because I already defined that class using the ES5 syntax instead of ES6. So now my person2, so now I can say like Morgan equals new person2, my name, give it my age. Now I get this person2 or whatever. It has introduce as part of its underscore underscore proto underscore underscore. So that means I can say Morgan dot introduce, and it works. So any functions I wanted to be a part of person2, I just define it here. I don't declare them with the function keyword. I don't declare them with let or const or anything. I just write them in here, and that's just how that works. There's some experimental syntax. So if I'm going to refresh, so I'm kind of resetting all this stuff. There we go. There's some experimental syntax, I think, which exists in Chrome right now, where I can also set global variables. So let's see. Or not global variables. I can set like instance variables in here that don't have to be in the constructor, I think. I don't know. It's not that important. I think what I wanted to show was a way to create class methods and class variables. That's something that Baron had asked about before, I think. So if I want a class variable, I could say static. Let's do it before we even do the constructor. Crap. Okay, static all equals this empty array. Now, anytime I create a new person, and I would say, by the way, this is not super common in JavaScript for whatever reason. Usually people will just keep track of their own arrays outside of the class. Just kind of depends. But here I can say all dot push this in my constructor. So every time I create a new one, it'll get pushed into that array. So now I can say person, we'll say I'll create a person. Interesting. All is, oh yeah. I need to say this dot all to refer to, no, I can't say this dot all because this refers to the new instance. So I need to say person dot all. So now if I do another one, now if I look at person.all, I get an array with 2 people in it. If I look at the first one, it's that first person I created. Second one is that second person I created. Does that make sense?
It does, although I feel like it's a very convoluted way of doing it, but personal opinion.
Fair enough. Keep in mind, none of this stuff is actually necessary. It's all syntactic sugar. So under the hood, first of all, this whole thing is automatically converted. Basically, when it tries to run it, it converts it to ES5. I believe that maybe there's newer JavaScript engines that don't have to do that anymore. I don't know, but that's how it worked for the longest time. And it still basically does work that way. Where it's like when I look at this Morgan object, it's still storing a like introduce method in on the prototype of the person class. So this is still prototypical inheritance. It's just dressed up to look more like classes that people are used to from other languages. But none of this stuff is totally necessary. You could always just create stuff with factories if you'd prefer. But it's good to learn the different approaches, and we do require for this project for you to use the ES6 class syntax to create objects. But it's kind of funny because all of this stuff got implemented pretty much just in time for everyone to sort of start jumping on board with functional programming instead of object-oriented programming. And so a lot of people shun the idea of object-oriented programming and inheritance altogether. maybe not entirely, but oftentimes people avoid it when they can, in favor of functional programming, which I would love to teach, but we don't really have time in the curriculum to teach functional programming. So that's something you'd have to mostly learn on your own. We'll cover some of the concepts during React, because React is built in such a way that encourages functional programming really often. But that's neither here nor there. So I think sometime this week, I can't remember what our study group is tomorrow, but sometime this week, I want to sort of rewrite some of our stuff in our Blogger app so that like our front end will make use of classes. So we'll have like a post class and like an author class, and we'll be able to create instances, and then we can have methods that will display those instances to the page. We can also create a class for fetching, so that all of our fetch logic can kind of live in like a fetcher type object. It just helps us separate logic that doesn't need to have anything to do with each other into discrete objects that can like do little jobs for us. It's also easier to like separate our code into more files, just so that overall everything makes more sense. So we'll talk about that at some point, but we are about out of time today. But thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, Morgan.
Message me if you have questions or get confused about any of this stuff, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.